The communication request from Commander Reth arrived while Dr. Una Beek was finishing her rounds in the recovery ward. She looked at the notification on her datapad with mild surprise, then instructed her team to continue without her while she found a quiet corner to take the call. The Korvathi commander appeared on her screen, with an expression that was difficult to read. His species communicated emotion through subtle changes in the coloration of their facial scales, and Una had never learned to interpret those signals with confidence. Dr. Beek, Reth began, his voice stiff and formal. I have received orders to withdraw from Vela space, and I will be complying with those orders within the hour. Una nodded politely but said nothing. Sensing that the commander had more to say before I leave, Reth continued. I find myself needing to ask you a question that has been troubling me since this situation began. Una leaned back against the wall and gave him her full attention. Go ahead, she said. Reth's facial scales shifted through several colors before he spoke again. Why did you come here? He asked, and I am not asking about official reasons or humanitarian protocols, or any of the justifications your government might provide. His eyes met hers through the screen with an intensity that surprised her. I am asking why you personally chose to answer a distress call from strangers who could offer you nothing in return, he pressed. Why you risk your life and your career and the safety of your crew for beings you had never met and might never see again. Una considered the question carefully before answering. She could have given him the easy response, the one about duty and professionalism and the sacred obligations of medical practice, but something in the commander's voice told her that he deserved a more honest answer. There is a concept in my culture called Jeng, she said slowly, choosing her words with care. It does not translate perfectly into other languages, but it refers to a deep bond that forms between people who have shared experiences together, especially difficult experiences. Reth's scales shifted again in what might have been confusion. You are saying you felt bonded to the Veleth before you even met them? He asked. Una shook her head. No, she replied. I am saying that humans have the capacity to feel that bond with anyone who is suffering, even if we have never met them. She paused to gather her thoughts. When we hear about someone in pain, we do not just understand it intellectually, she continued. We feel it ourselves in a way that makes it impossible to ignore. The Veleth were dying, and they were afraid, and they were alone. And when I heard their distress call, something inside me responded to their pain, as though it were my own. She spread her hands in a gesture that was half apology and half explanation. I know this does not make sense to species who evolve differently, she admitted. And I know it makes us seem unpredictable and dangerous to beings who prefer rational calculations, but we cannot help what we are. And what we are is a species that finds suffering unbearable when we have the power to stop it. Reth was silent for a long moment, his scales cycling through colors that Una could not interpret. Finally, he spoke again, his voice quieter than before. Among my people, he said slowly, we have a saying that goes something like this: beware the species that fights for something other than survival, for they cannot be defeated by conventional means. He tilted his head in a gesture that might have been respect. I always interpreted that saying as a warning about dangerous enemies, he continued, but perhaps I was understanding it incorrectly. Perhaps it was also meant to describe dangerous allies. Una smiled at that, a genuine expression of warmth that she hoped would translate across species lines. Commander, she said, I do not know if humans will ever be fully accepted by the Galactic Assembly. I'm not sure we deserve to be given some of the things our species has done in our history, but I believe that kindness is never wasted, she added, even when it comes from unexpected sources, and even when it makes the universe a little less predictable. She looked directly into the camera with eyes that held no fear and no apology. We are what we are, she concluded, and we will keep being what we are regardless of whether the galaxy approves. Because that is the only way we know how to live. Reth nodded slowly, his scales settling into a pattern that Una suspected indicated deep thought. "I wish you well, Dr. Beak," he said, "and I hope that the next time our species meet, it will be under more pleasant circumstances." The communication ended, and Una stood alone in the quiet corridor for a moment before returning to her patients. The official ceremony took place 3 weeks later on Station Velith Prime. After the last of the plague victims had been treated and the cure had been distributed to every affected world, High Chancellor Mirith presided over the gathering, which included representatives from the 12 species that had rallied to the Velith cause and a delegation from the Galactic Assembly that had been sent to observe the proceedings. Dr. Una Beak stood with her crew at the center of the Great Hall, looking uncomfortable in the formal dress uniform she had been required to wear. She was not accustomed to being the center of attention, preferring the quiet satisfaction of work well done to public recognition. But she understood that this ceremony was not really about her. It was about what she represented on behalf of the Velith sovereignty. Mirith announced, her voice carrying across the crowded hall, "I hereby extend the offer of formal alliance to the United Earth Medical Corps and the human species they represent." The hall fell silent as the weight of her words settled over everyone present. "This is not an alliance of politics or trade or military cooperation," Mirith continued, her 4 eyes glistening with emotion. "This is an alliance of friendship, born from the darkest moment of our history and forged in the compassion of those who came to help us when we had nothing to offer in return." She turned to face Una directly. "Dr. Beak," she said, "your people gave us something more valuable than medicine or technology. You gave us proof that kindness still exists in a galaxy that had taught us to expect only indifference." Una stepped forward and accepted the ceremonial token that Mirith offered, a small crystal that contained a sample of the cure that had saved the Velith people. "Chancellor," she replied, her voice steady despite the emotion she felt, "among my people we have a saying that a friend in need is a friend indeed." She held up the crystal so that it caught the light. "You needed help," she continued, "and we were able to provide it. And that simple exchange has made us friends in a way that no treaty or protocol could ever accomplish." She looked out at the gathered dignitaries, at the Velith who had survived the plague and the aliens who had come to witness this moment. "I hope this is the beginning of something larger," she said. "I hope that the next time someone sends a distress call into the void, they will not be met with silence." She smiled, and this time it was a smile that everyone in the room could understand regardless of their species, because the galaxy is full of darkness, she concluded, but it only takes a few people willing to carry a light to make the darkness a little less frightening. The ceremony ended with applause that echoed through the great hall and spilled out into the corridors beyond. The Mercy of Soul departed Velith space 3 days later, carrying a crew that was exhausted but proud, and a story that would be told across 1,000 worlds. And in the years that followed, other ships bearing the symbol of the United Earth Medical Corps would answer other distress calls from other desperate civilizations. Each time, they would face the same fear and suspicion that Una had encountered on her first mission. Each time, they would prove through their actions that humanity's reputation for danger was only half the story. The Deathworlders had arrived in the galaxy, and they had brought something with them that no one had expected. They had brought hope, and hope, as the Velith had learned, was the most powerful medicine of all. Commander Reth stood on the bridge of his flagship and stared at the defiant message from the Velith Chancellor with cold fury burning in his chest. He had served the Galactic Assembly for over 40 years, enforcing the laws that kept civilization safe from the chaos that lurked at its edges. The Deathworlder protocols were not arbitrary restrictions invented by paranoid bureaucrats. They were the product of centuries of careful observation and painful experience. Humanity had only been part of the galactic community for 80 years. A mere blink of an eye by the standards of species that had traveled among the stars for millennia. In that brief time, they had earned a reputation that made even the most aggressive warrior species nervous. They did not fight like civilized beings who understood the rules of engagement. They fought like cornered animals, with a ferocity that defied all rational calculation. But what truly frightened the assembly was not human violence, but rather human compassion. The humans formed bonds with other species too quickly and too deeply, treating aliens they had just met as though they were family members worth dying for. This made them unpredictable in ways that threatened the careful balance of power that kept the balls galaxy stable. A species that would sacrifice itself for strangers was a species that could keep it not be controlled through conventional diplomacy. Commander Reth understood all of this, which was why he had positioned his 3 cruisers to blockade the Velas system. The humans would not be allowed to establish a foothold here, regardless of what services they claimed to be providing. Helm, he ordered, move us into formation around the primary station and prepare to intercept any vessel attempting to leave the system. The bridge crew complied with smooth efficiency, and within hours, the blockade was complete. From his position, Reth could monitor all traffic entering or leaving Velas space. Nothing moved without his permission on Station Velas Prime. High Chancellor Mirith watched the assembly cruisers take up their positions and felt the walls closing in around her. She had made her choice, and she did not regret it. But she could not ignore the reality of her situation. The Velith had no military to speak of, and even if they did, their fragile bodies made them poorly suited for combat. They could not fight their way out of this blockade. They could only hope that words would succeed where weapons could not. Chancellor, a communications officer reported, "We are receiving requests for statements from 17 different news networks across the galaxy, and the story of the human medical mission is spreading faster than we can track it." Mirith felt a small spark of hope ignite in her chest. The assembly drew its power from the consent of its member species, and that consent was built on the belief that the assembly acted in the common good. If she could show the galaxy that the assembly was punishing the Velith for accepting help during a plague, that narrative might begin to crumble. Prepare a broadcast, she instructed, and make sure it reaches every corner of civilized space. The message she composed was simple and devastating. She described the plague that had threatened to exterminate her people, and the silence that had greeted her desperate pleas for assistance. She talked about the humans who had answered when no one else would, the doctors who had walked into a death zone without hesitation, and the crew members who had given their own blood to create a cure. She asked the galaxy a single question that she hoped would echo in the conscience of every being who heard it. If the humans are as dangerous as the assembly claims, she said, then why did they come to save us when the assembly left us to die? The broadcast spread like fire across dry grasslands, carried by news networks that recognized a compelling story when they saw one. Within hours, billions of beings across thousands of worlds were discussing the situation in Velith space. Some sided with the assembly, arguing the protocols existed for good reasons and that the Velith had been foolish to trust Deathworlders. But others began to share their own stories. A merchant from the Deshan Collective admitted that human traders had once saved his ship from pirates at great risk to themselves. A scientist from the Morva technocracy confessed that her greatest breakthrough had come from collaboration with a human researcher who had refused to accept payment for his contributions. A diplomat from a minor species near the Galactic Rim revealed that humans had helped his people survive a famine by shipping food supplies across 3 sectors without asking for anything in return. The stories piled up, one after another, painting a picture of humanity that did not match the assembly's official narrative. Humans were dangerous, yes, but they were also generous and loyal and brave in ways that made other species uncomfortable, Commander Reth received reports of the shifting public opinion and felt his certainty beginning to waver. He had never questioned the Assembly's policies before, had never needed to question them because they had always seemed so obviously correct. But now he found himself wondering if perhaps he was on the wrong side of history. The Assembly Council convened an emergency session to address the growing controversy. Representatives from dozens of species argued back and forth about whether the Deathworlder protocols should be modified to allow for humanitarian exceptions. The debate was heated and inconclusive, with factions forming along lines that had nothing to do with the original question. Meanwhile, on Vela 3, Dr. Una Beek continued her work as though the political drama unfolding above her did not exist. She treated patients and trained local medical staff and refined her treatment protocols with the same quiet determination she had shown from the beginning. When her team asked her if she was worried about the blockade, she simply shrugged. "I did not become a doctor to worry about politics," she said. "And I am not going to start now." Security Officer Yoonji Choi approached her during a rare moment of rest. Her expression troubled Dr. Yoonji said carefully, "You know that if the Assembly forces Chancellor Mirith to comply, we will be deported back to Earth and everything we have built here will be dismantled." Yuna nodded without looking up from her patient charts. "I know," she replied, "and you are not concerned." Yoonji pressed. Yuna finally met her eyes with a gaze that was calm and clear, and utterly without fear. "I am concerned about the 12,000 patients on this world who still need treatment," she said, "and I am concerned about the millions more on other worlds who are waiting for the cure we developed here." She returned her attention to her work. "The Assembly can do what they want with me," she added, "but they cannot undo the good we have already done, and they cannot stop the truth from spreading." Yoonji wanted to point out that the Assembly had far more power than one human doctor, but something in Yuna's quiet confidence stopped her. Perhaps that was the true source of humanity's strength. Yoonji realized it was not their dense bones or their aggressive immune systems or their terrifying endurance. It was their absolute refusal to stop doing what they believed was right, regardless of the consequences. The standoff continued for 3 more days. With neither side willing to back down, Commander Reth maintained his blockade while Chancellor Mirith continued her broadcasts, while Dr. Una Beek kept treating patients as though nothing else mattered. And across the galaxy, billions of beings watched and waited to see how the story would end. The answer came not from the Assembly, Council chambers, or the blockading cruisers, but from an unexpected source entirely. A coalition of 12 minor species announced that they would be sending their own medical teams to Velaspace to assist the humans in their work. They cited the growing evidence that humanity's intentions were genuinely benevolent, and declared that they would not stand by while the Assembly punished good deeds. The announcement shattered the political deadlock. The Assembly could blockade 1 medical frigate, but they could not blockade 12 different species without appearing tyrannical. Commander Reth received new orders from the Council within hours. He was to stand down and allow the situation to resolve through diplomatic channels. The blockade was over, but as Reth prepared to withdraw his cruisers, he found himself making an unusual decision. He requested a private communication channel with the human doctor who had started all of this. He needed to understand something before he left. The laboratory that Dr. Una Beek had assembled from salvaged equipment and human ingenuity hummed with activity at all hours of the day and night. She had not slept in 4 days, and yet she felt more alive than she had in years. The plague was clever. She had to admit that much. It attacked the Veleth immune system with a precision that suggested either natural evolution in an extremely hostile environment or deliberate engineering by some unknown intelligence. The pathogen inserted itself into the cellular structure of its host and then slowly converted healthy tissue into factories for producing more copies of itself by the time symptoms appeared. The infection had already spread to every major organ system, but Yuna had noticed something interesting. During her analysis of the blood samples, the plague required a specific temperature range to reproduce effectively, and that range was precisely calibrated to Velith biology at temperatures even slightly above the Velith norm. The pathogen became sluggish and disorganized at temperatures that would constitute a mild fever in humans. The pathogen simply fell apart. This is our answer, Yuna announced to her exhausted team as they gathered around her workstation. Dr. Minjin Park leaned forward to examine the data on her screen. His eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep, but still sharp with scientific curiosity. "You are suggesting we induce fever in the patients?" he asked, "but their bodies cannot tolerate elevated temperatures, and the thermal shock alone would kill them." Before the cure could take effect, Yuna shook her head and pointed to a different section of the analysis. "Not their fever," she corrected. "Ours." The team fell silent as they processed the implications of her statement. Human immune responses produce specific proteins during fever states, Yuna explained. And these proteins are designed to denature foreign organisms that cannot survive elevated temperatures. If we can synthesize a treatment based on these proteins and adapt it for Velith physiology, we might be able to destroy the plague without requiring the patients to actually experience fever themselves. Nurse Soyun Kim spoke up from the corner of the room, her voice hesitant. "How would we obtain enough of these proteins to treat 400 million patients?" she asked. Yuna met her eyes steadily before answering. "We would need blood donations from every human aboard the Mercy of Soul," she said, "and possibly multiple donations over an extended period." The room went quiet again as everyone considered what that would mean. Human blood was not like Velith blood. It was thick and rich with iron, filled with aggressive cells that attacked anything they did not recognize as part of the body. Donating blood was uncomfortable for humans, and doing it repeatedly could cause fatigue, weakness, and other complications, but it would not kill them. And that was the important part. "I will contact the ship," Yuna decided, and asked for volunteers. To her complete lack of surprise, every single human aboard the Mercy of Soul volunteered without hesitation. The blood donations began the following day, with crew members rotating through the medical bay in shifts that allowed the ship to maintain essential functions while still providing enough raw material for Yuna's research. Captain Dong Yun Kang was the first to roll up his sleeve, insisting that a leader should never ask his people to do something he would not do himself. Engineer Hannah Shin donated despite her fear of needles, closing her eyes and reciting song lyrics to distract herself from the procedure. Cook Junwoo Lim joked that he had plenty of blood to spare after all the good meals he had been eating. Even the youngest crew member, Communications Officer Min Ji-yoon, who was barely 22 years old, gave what she could with a smile on her face. Back on Velith 3, Yuna worked around the clock to synthesize the treatment. The process was painstaking and precise, requiring her to carefully extract the relevant proteins from the donated blood and then modify them so they would be compatible with Velith biology. Every batch had to be tested multiple times before it could be used on actual patients. The first trial was on a Velith child named Desik, who had been infected for nearly 20 cycles and was expected to die within the next 3. Yuna administered the treatment personally, holding the small being's hand as the modified human proteins entered their bloodstream. For the first hour, nothing happened. Then the 6 vital signs began to stabilize within 6 hours. The plague's progress had halted entirely within 12 hours. The child was showing signs of recovery that the Velith doctors had said were impossible. "It works," Minjun breathed, staring at the medical readouts with tears forming in his eyes. It actually works. Yuna allowed herself a moment of pure, overwhelming relief. Before her training reasserted itself, we need to scale up production immediately. She ordered, and we need more blood from the ship. The news spread across the Velith worlds like wildfire, carrying hope to billions who had resigned themselves to death. High Chancellor Mirith wept openly when she received Yuna's report, her 4 eyes streaming with tears that she did not bother to hide. But not everyone was pleased by the developments on Velith 3. A Galactic Assembly patrol had been monitoring the situation from the edge of the system, and the presence of humans in sovereignty space had not gone unnoticed. The patrol consisted of 3 cruisers under the command of an officer named Reth, who belonged to a species called the Korvathi that had long viewed humanity as a seas threat to galactic stability. Commander Reth transmitted his demands on an open channel that reached every communication device in the system. "Attention Velith sovereignty," his cold voice announced. "You are harboring Category 7 Deathworlders in violation of Galactic Assembly Directive 774, and you are ordered to surrender the human vessel and its crew for immediate deportation to Sol System High." Chancellor Mirith received the transmission aboard Station Velith Prime and felt her heart sink in her chest. She had known this moment would come eventually, but she had hoped to have more time. Chancellor, Senior Diplomat Korath urged, "We must comply with the Assembly's demands or face economic sanctions that could devastate our civilization for generations." Mirith looked at the data streaming in from Velith 3, showing the thousands of patients who were already recovering thanks to the human treatment. She thought about the millions more who were still waiting for their chance at salvation, and she thought about Dr. Yuna Beak, who had asked for nothing in return for risking her life to save strangers. "No," Mirith said firmly, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. Chancellor Korath protested, but Mirith raised a hand to silence him. "The humans came when no one else would," she declared, "and they gave their own blood to cure our plague while the Galactic Assembly watched us die from a safe distance." She straightened her spine and lifted her chin in a gesture of defiance that felt foreign to her peaceful nature. "I will not betray the people who saved us," she continued. "And if the Assembly wishes to punish us for showing gratitude to our rescuers, then they will have to explain to the entire galaxy why kindness is a crime." The transmission she sent back to Commander Reth was brief and unmistakable. "The humans stay," she said, "and if you want them, you will have to come through us first." Down on Velith 3, Yuna received word of Mirith's defiance while she was in the middle of administering treatment to a family of 5. She paused for a moment to process the information, then returned to her work without comment. There would be time to worry about politics later. Right now, she had patients to save. Dr. Yuna Beak had seen fear in many forms during her 15 years of medical service, but she had never seen anything quite like the terror that filled the eyes of the Velith. They flinched when she moved too quickly, pressed themselves against walls when she walked past, and spoke to her in voices that trembled like leaves in a storm. She understood their fear, even if she did not share it to the Velith. She was a monster from a nightmare world, a creature forged in an environment so hostile that simply surviving it required becoming something dangerous. Yuna had read the Galactic Assembly's classification reports on humanity, and she knew how other species perceived her kind. They saw humans as apex predators, pretending to be civilized, as wolves wearing the clothing of sheep, as a threat that had not yet revealed its true nature. But Yuna had not traveled across the stars to frighten anyone. She had come to save lives, and that was exactly what she intended to do. The briefing room on Station Velith Prime was cold by human standards, which meant it was comfortable for the fragile beings who called this place home. Yuna sat at a table designed for Velith proportions, feeling like a giant in a dollhouse, and listened as High Chancellor Mirith explained the scope of the disaster. The plague first appeared on our agricultural world Velith 3 approximately 40 cycles ago, Mirith said, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had not slept properly in weeks. Initial cases were isolated to a single farming community, but the pathogen spread faster than our quarantine measures could contain it. How many infected? Yuna asked, her mind already racing through diagnostic possibilities. Mirith's 4 eyes closed briefly before she answered at current estimates. Approximately 400 million across 12 worlds, she said, with a mortality rate of 67%. Among those who reached the terminal stage, Yuna felt her stomach tighten at the numbers. But she kept her expression calm and professional. These people needed confidence from her, not visible distress. What treatment protocols have you attempted so far? She inquired. Mirith gestured to a Velith scientist who had been standing silently in the corner, and the smaller being stepped forward with obvious reluctance. We have tried antiviral compounds, immune boosters, and targeted cellular therapy, the scientist said, her voice barely above a whisper. Nothing has shown significant effectiveness against the pathogen, and several treatments have actually accelerated the disease progression. Can you show me patient samples? Yuna asked. The scientist's skin paled to an almost white color, which Yuna had learned indicated extreme fear in Velith biology. The samples are held at our primary research facility on Velith 3, the scientist explained, but that world has been classified as uninhabitable for healthy Velith due to atmospheric contamination from the plague. Yuna nodded slowly as she processed this information. What about the infected patients themselves? She asked. Where are they being treated? They are not being treated, Mirith admitted, her voice heavy with shame and sorrow. We were forced to abandon surface operations when the contamination levels exceeded safe thresholds for our species, and the patients who remained on the surface have been left to either recover on their own or die. The room fell silent as the weight of that statement settled over everyone present. Yuna understood what Mirith was not saying directly. The Velith had left their own people to die because they lacked the physical capability to survive the conditions on the plague world. It was not cruelty, but rather the terrible mathematics of survival. The cold calculation that said some must be sacrificed so that others might live. But Yuna had not come here to accept cold calculations. She had come here to change the equation entirely. I need to go to Velith 3, she announced, standing up from the tiny chair and stretching to her full height. The Velith in the room shrank back instinctively, and Yuna made a conscious effort to soften her posture. Dr. Beak, Mirith protested. The atmospheric conditions on Velith 3 would be lethal to your team within hours. Yuna allowed herself a small smile that she hoped looked reassuring rather than predatory. Chancellor, she said gently, the conditions you describe as lethal for your species are what humans call Tuesday, and our bodies evolved on a world where the air itself tried to kill us on a regular basis. She turned to face the Velith scientist directly, noting how the smaller being trembled at her attention. What are the specific hazards? Yuna asked. The scientist consulted a datapad with shaking hands before responding. Elevated atmospheric pressure, approximately 3 times Velith standard, she said, with toxic particulate matter from the disease vector suspended in the air and ambient temperature ranges that would cause thermal shock to Velith physiology. Yuna did the mental conversions and almost laughed out loud. That was roughly equivalent to a humid summer day in her hometown of Bizin with some dust mixed in. She could handle that with basic respiratory equipment and maybe a light jacket. I will need a shuttle to the surface, Yuna declared, and I will take a team of 5, including myself. Mirith rose from her seat with an expression that mixed hope and horror in equal measure. You would do this? She asked. You would risk your lives for people you have never met, Dr. Beak. Una replied, I became a physician because I could not stand the thought of someone suffering when I had the power to help them. And that feeling does not change based on what planet those people were born on. She began walking toward the door, then paused and looked back at the gathered Velith besides. She added, Where I come from, we have a saying that goes something like this. A problem shared is a problem halved. And right now, your problem is my problem too. The shuttle descended through the murky atmosphere of Velith. 3 with Una and her team strapped into seats designed for much smaller bodies. Through the viewport, she could see the surface emerging from the haze. A landscape of gentle hills and wide plains that would have been beautiful if not for the empty cities dotting the terrain. This is Landing Zone 7, the pilot announced over the intercom. I'm reading approximately 12,000. Life signs within a 2-kilometer radius. Una checked her equipment one final time and nodded to her colleagues. Dr. Minjin Park was the youngest member of the team at 28 years old, but his expertise in infectious diseases made him invaluable. Nurse Sien Kim had served in disaster zones across 3 continents and had seen things that would break most people. Paramedic Ji-Hoon Lee could set up a field hospital faster than anyone Una had ever worked with, and security officer Yoonji Choi was there to make sure they all came home alive. The shuttle touched down in what had once been a public park, and the team emerged into an environment that smelled of sickness and despair. Una took a deep breath of the filtered air from her mask and began walking toward the nearest structure, which appeared to be a medical facility that had been converted into a makeshift hospice inside. She found them hundreds of Velith lying on cots and blankets and bare floors, their fragile bodies racked by the plague that was slowly killing them. Some were unconscious while others watched her approach with eyes that held no fear, only a desperate, flickering hope. One of the patients reached out a trembling hand toward Una, and she took it gently in her own massive human grip. Help us, the patient whispered. Please help us. Una squeezed the small hand carefully, conscious of how easy it would be for her to accidentally cause harm. That is exactly what I am here to do, she promised. And I am not leaving until you are better. She turned to her team and began issuing orders with the calm efficiency that came from years of practice. Within 12 hours, they had established a functional field hospital in the abandoned facility. Within 24 hours, they had begun collecting samples and running tests, and within 48 hours, Dr. Unibeak had made a discovery that would change everything. The plague could be beaten, but only if the humans were willing to give something of themselves to do it. The warning lights had been flashing for 17 days now, and High Chancellor Mirith could no longer remember what silence felt like. She stood before the great observation window of Station Velith Prime, watching transport ships carry the infected away to quarantine worlds, where they would either recover or die alone. The plague had no name yet because the Velith scientists could not understand it well enough to classify it properly. All they knew was that it spread through air, through touch, through water, and that it killed within 30 cycles of infection. Mireth pressed her 4-fingered hand against the cold glass and felt the weight of 3 billion lives pressing down upon her narrow shoulders. The Velith were not warrior species, and they had never needed to be one. They had evolved on a gentle world of soft winds and calm seas, where the greatest predator was no larger than a human house cat. Their bodies were fragile by galactic standards, with hollow bones and thin skin that bruised at the slightest pressure. Their lungs could only process the most delicate atmospheric compositions, and their hearts beat so softly that most species could not detect them without medical equipment for 10,000 years. This fragility had been their strength. Other species saw them as harmless and welcomed them as traders, diplomats, and mediators in conflicts. They had no stake in the Velith, had built their civilization on trust rather than weapons, on commerce rather than conquest. But trust could not cure a plague. And commerce meant nothing when your trading partners refused to answer your calls. Mirith turned away from the window and walked toward the communication center, where her advisors waited with faces that held no hope. Senior diplomat Korath spoke first, his voice trembling in the way it always did when he delivered bad news. The Galactic Assembly has formally declined our request for medical assistance, he said. They cite the unknown nature of the pathogen and the risk of cross-species contamination. Mirith had expected this answer, but hearing it spoken aloud still felt like a blade sliding between her ribs. What about the Deshan Collective? She asked, keeping her voice steady through sheer force of will. They have the most advanced biomedical technology in the known galaxy. Korath's secondary eyes blinked rapidly, a sign of extreme distress among their kind. The Veshans have closed their borders entirely, he replied. They are not even accepting communication requests from infected systems and the Morvith technocracy. Mirith pressed, though she already knew what he would say. The Morvith have offered to sell us research data at a price that would bankrupt the bestiality sovereignty for the next 3 centuries. Korath answered, they know we are desperate and they intend to profit from our desperation. Mirith closed her eyes and allowed herself one moment of pure, crushing despair. When she opened them again, her resolve had hardened into something cold and sharp. Then we broadcast openly, she declared to everyone and anyone who will listen. We send a distress call across all frequencies and all channels. We beg if we must, and we accept help from whoever offers it. Chancellor Korath protested. An open broadcast could attract unwanted attention from hostile species or those who might seek to exploit our weakness. We are already dying. Mirith snapped, her patience finally breaking. What greater exploitation could there be than watching us perish while the galaxy does nothing? Send the broadcast now. The message went out across the stars, carrying the desperation of a dying civilization in every syllable. For 3 days, the Velith waited in silence. On the 4th day, a response came from a system that made Korath's skin turn pale with terror. Chancellor, he whispered, a ship has answered our call, and it comes from Sol System. Mirith felt her heart stutter in her chest, because every spacefaring species knew about Sol System and its inhabitants. The humans were classified as Category 7 Deathworlders, a designation reserved for species so dangerous that contact with them required special permits and hazard protocols. Their homeworld was a nightmare of extreme gravity, violent tectonic activity, and an atmosphere that would poison most species within minutes. They had evolved alongside predators that could tear through metal with their claws, and prey animals that could trample a Velith into paste. Without noticing, the humans themselves were terrifying beyond measure, with dense bones that could withstand impacts that would shatter Velith skeletons, and muscles that could generate force equivalent to industrial machinery. They could survive temperature ranges that would kill most species instantly, and their immune systems were so aggressive that they regularly waged internal wars against invading organisms. But what frightened the galaxy most was not their physical capabilities, but rather their psychology. Humans did not think like civilized species were supposed to think. They formed irrational attachments to other beings, sometimes even to members of different species, and they would take insane risks to protect these attachments. They had been known to sacrifice their own lives for strangers, a behavior that no evolutionary model could adequately explain. Some xenopsychologists theorized that humans were simply broken, that their evolution had produced a species of noble madmen who could not recognize their own best interests. The ship approaching Vela space was called the Mercy of Sol, and its commander was requesting permission to dock. "What do we do?" Korath asked, his voice barely audible. Mirith stared at the communication screen for a long moment. watching the human vessel grow larger as it approached. It was a medical frigate, designed for disaster relief and emergency response. And it bore no visible weapons. The humans had come to help, not to conquer. Every instinct in Mirth's body screamed at her to refuse, to send the Deathworlders away before they could do whatever terrible things Deathworlders did. But then she thought of the 3 billion Velith who were counting on her to save them. And she thought of the Galactic Assembly that had abandoned them to die, grant them docking clearance. She said, "And may the ancestors forgive me if I am making a mistake." The mercy of soul slid into the stations docking bay with a grace that seemed impossible for a vessel of its size. Mirth watched through the observation deck as the airlock cycled open and the humans emerged. There were 12 of them, wearing white medical uniforms with red symbols on their shoulders, and they moved with a confidence that made the Velith guards shrink back in fear. The leader was a female human with dark hair pulled back from her face, and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She walked directly toward Mirth and stopped at a respectful distance before speaking in the Velith language with an accent that was rough but understandable. "Hi, Chancellor," she said. "I am Dr. Unibeak of the United Earth Medical Corps, and we have come to help your people." Mirth forced herself to meet the human's eyes, even though every cell in her body wanted to flee. "Why?" she asked, the question escaping before she could stop it. Dr. Beak tilted her head slightly, as if the question confused her. "Because you asked." She replied simply, "And because we could, in that moment." Mirth realized that she had been wrong about humans. They were not noble madmen or broken creatures who could not recognize their own interests. They were something far more dangerous than that. They were kind, and kindness, Mirth was beginning to understand, was the most terrifying force in the universe.